Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 25th of April 2024. Biggest news just coming out right now before I do my Frontline update is the US is appearing to be putting the final touches on a massive $6 billion weapons package for Ukraine. Now, I'm really glad that at least some of these outlets are reporting this, given that I've just done a video explaining how the aid package works, that they're calling this $6 billion in weapons contracts, because I don't think Ukraine will see much of this for a couple of years' time. So the US is preparing the largest package in history under the USAI program, totaling $6 billion. The package will include Patriot air defense systems, artillery ammunition, drones, counter-drone equipment, and air-to-air missiles to be installed on fighter jets. I could be looking at F-16s down the track, etc., etc. Okay, so don't get too excited that you're going to see $6 billion worth of kit turn up in Ukraine in 2 weeks' time. Some of this stuff might well be 2 years down the track. But of course, they need to be doing this sort of now in order to get that stuff when they need it. In fact, they should have been doing this 2 years ago. Okay, so that's not a criticism. It's just like we need to understand how this all works. And this is USAI, so it's the orders to the manufacturers, and then they either get put to the end of the queue, or possibly they're expedited. Just don't know. But anyway, that's the latest. I'll report on that tomorrow as well. Right. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the video at the moment. Pause the video. Right. Again, before I want to start, it's so important to understand what's going on in terms of getting a holistic view. Right, here is the map, and there are pins on the map, and these pins refer to, small villages and tree lines and fields and dugouts. And when we look at the minutiae of the front line, we can get a sense that all things are terrible. Like, it's going really badly in Ocheretny area and around that northern Avdiivka salient at the moment. It is not looking good. I speak to Greg Terry, and he's really down about, what he's hearing from troops on the front line. And you are going to, Russia are attacking all along the eastern front line. So any troops along the eastern front line are going to be saying life sucks, and it sucks hard at the moment because you've got no artillery ammunition. We're at the end of our, tether in terms of morale and energy. We haven't been rotated for a year. I've lost a lot of my comrades. We've not got equipment. Just things suck. What you also need to remember is that the Russians are going to be feeling that too, perhaps even more in terms of morale. They have barrier troops. They've got, severe lack of training often, severe lack of equipment themselves. They're not getting rotated, and it is not good. But there's just more of them. And and they are on the offensive, Ukraine are on the defensive. So we need to understand that this video is about drilling down and getting the micro perspective. And it might seem like everything's doom and gloom and it sucks for the Ukrainians. But when you look at the fact that there's a $6 billion set of contracts coming their way, when you look at what's been going on with the USA package in Europe, the UK is on a war footing, arguably, or moving our defense economy towards that. You've got Germany doing all sorts of things, Poland doing stuff, the Nordics, the Baltics, etc., etc. Then you realise that there's a much bigger game of chess going on here. And we need to get an understanding of this war from both perspectives to get a proper reflection of what is actually going on. And I'm going to refer you back to Andrew Perpetua's really insightful comment yesterday. The more you zoom out, the more the situation looks worse for Russia. The more their long-term prospects are really bad. But when you zoom into details, it flips and Russia looks like it's in a better position. The trick is balancing the two perspectives. I was having a chat with Pierre Dupont, who I was moseying around Ukraine with in the back of the battle bus, with Greg and Zhenya in the front and Pierre and myself in the back. And that's who Pierre is. And we're having a chat, and he's like, yeah, I think Ukraine are at their worst point now. And like, things can only get better, but also it's like, that's the micro sense. When you're talking to people on the ground, you're going to get that sense. You're not talking to Russians, right? You're only talking to Ukrainians. But when you zoom out, we get a different view of things. If you stay too focused on one or the other, you lose perspective. Both are important. The short-term advantages Russia has must be actively mitigated, and you must also understand that they are short-term. If you don't take these issues seriously, bad things will happen. But at the same time, they shouldn't be taken too strongly as to imply they will last forever, because they cannot and will not. All planning at every level, from government down to volunteers, should be built around balancing the long and the short-term realities. Andrew Perpetua has nailed that just so succinctly and so brilliantly. So things are bad on the front line for Ukraine, but my opinion would be they are, worst case scenario, the Russians might just about make it to Pokrovsk here, which would be a really big job for them to take, and they've got to go past the proper Ukrainian defences that are between Avdiivka and Pokrovsk. And at the moment, the Ukrainians have gone to their not proper defensive. They're sitting back behind the Drina River, and that will be compromised at the moment by what the Russians are doing north of here. And that came as a big mistake that happened, and it was a cock up, and it's cost the Ukrainians dearly, but dearly in a very localized sense. This is not going to see the Russians take Mykolaiv. Is not going to see the Russians take Odessa and the whole land bridge to Transnistria. So perspective. However, things are fairly bad in a number of places on the front line. Right. Let's start with Ocheretny. After saying that, look, okay, perspective, there is no change to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea again. No change to the Seversk axis. No change to Bakhmut, as according to our mapping sources here. That is really, really significant. Chasiv Yar has stabilised at least somewhat, and there's been some pushback to the south of there by the Ukrainians. That should be seen as really good news. Chasiv Yar might well fall this summer. But again, that is about the perspective of losing Chasiv Yar as well. And then when we come down to this northern Avdiivka area, we have Andrew Perpetua admitting that it's the Russians have pushed right up to the river from the source of the river Drina at Bedichi right down to Semenivka. We have Surat Maps claiming the Russians have a much greater control around Semenivka here. But yeah, it's not looking great for the Ukrainians there, and it's not helped by this area to the north around Ocheretny and Novobakhmutivka, and indeed this other settlement, which is Soloive, pronounced something like that, and it's not even rendering because there are too many things around it. But anyway, this settlement there. So yeah, it's challenging for the Ukrainians. Let's see what Emil Castellhelmi says. Situation in Donetsk is becoming increasingly worrying. The Ukrainians are under heavy pressure. In the last days, Russians have widened their control around Ocheretny, taking Novobakhmutivka and entering Solovyove. That's what it is. At the same time, Russians push deeper into Krasnohorivka, and we'll come to that in a second. However, Ukrainians have managed to deny actual breakthroughs, and if needed, they are prepared fortifications in the rear, which are continuously being expanded. Ukraine also transferred the 100th Brigade to the area to prevent further Russian advance. Further developments depend on Russian actions. If they concentrate heavy forces in the area of these few small villages to reinforce success, they may gain some more ground. However, there's still a long way before they can threaten any important towns in this direction. The situation is constantly developing. So my opinion is that the Russians are on their knees. I've been saying that for some time. The Ukrainians are on their knees. The long-term prognosis, I think. So the question is, who would you rather be, Russia or Ukraine? Ukraine every day of the week. Like, Russia are not going to take Ukraine. Okay? So it's about how much support we give to Ukraine and how ongoing that's going to be, how long term that's going to be, and also how much Ukraine can mobilize. There's increasing pressure on them to mobilize. We need to see, though, they need to see those boots on the ground. But we are going to be talking about this tomorrow. But we are, I think, needing to realize, by we, I mean all the countries who are supporting Ukraine, places that most of you are living in watching this. I think we need to realize that we are pretty much in World War III at the moment, but no one really wants to admit it. UK has got onto a war economy potentially in the defence sector, and that's as according to our defence secretary. The same is being talked about in other places. You've got security agreements taking place between Ukraine and most of the countries in Europe. You have France's Emmanuel Macron talking big time at the moment about this stuff. You've got Germany doing all sorts of stuff. You've got Poland talking about it today in their rehash of their foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their strategy going forward. You've got Europe resoundingly voting for a resolution that Russia's election should not be recognised. You've got the Nordic states and the Baltics getting increasingly supporting Ukraine, and you've got the US coming through in a pretty resounding senatorial bipartisan agreement. I mean, that's really resounding. As far as bipartisan agreements go, that was good. Okay, so this is all shaping up to be, as I've said, I think this whole war is an inflection point in history, but I think we are moving towards a much more formalised kind of war status. And I'm not trying to be war hawkish. I don't think the populations of the countries that you're looking at on a map now realise this. If I go down to the local shop tomorrow, this is not going to be on anyone's minds in the same way that World War II was. But I think that our governments realise this, and our governments are doing things like that. The UK decided to up their defence spending by £75 billion, or in real terms probably £20 billion, but over 6 years to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, upping that from just over 2% to 2.5% is huge. That is massive, right? But our population won't realise that. But our governments do, and the intelligence does. Mike Johnson came out today and said, yeah, a large reason why I changed my opinion is due to the intelligence I received. The people in the know, right? We're getting onto a kind of World War III footing here. And so I know this is a lot of me sort of talking in big abstract terms and not looking at the micro here, but it's understanding that if we are all serious about our support for Ukraine, and we absolutely should be, because the cost of not helping Ukraine is not worth thinking about, this will secure much better our democratic integrity going forward. We need Ukraine to win on a battlefield so we can win in the information spaces, so that Russia can't interfere with our democracies. So this is serious. I'd much rather be Ukraine than Russia. So when we go back to Ocheretny, it's about understanding the zoomed in and the zoomed out. This is not looking good here. Soldiers are dying. The Ukrainians might well have to retreat here. They might lose, goodness me, they could lose past Pokrovsk, back to Slovyanka here. It doesn't really change much. I'd still rather be Ukraine than Russia. Russia are in a precarious position economically, and diplomatically, and militarily. And I think as long as Ukraine continue to get the equipment they need, particularly distance weapons, and they mobilise, I think you're going to start seeing Russia get hit with an awful lot of rockets and missiles and drones, and it's going to be interesting to see what targets within Russia will be hit. No report says the Russian RAG, so the Russian flag, is hoisted in the eastern part of Solovyove, Avdiivka direction. It's likely that Russian forces control the small settlement. The Ukrainians have retreated further west towards Sokil and Novopokrovska. That has been geolocated to this point, the flag, so we'll pop that in. And again, this has been some of the fastest areas of Russian exchange of control I think we've seen for some time, possibly even faster than the kind of Avdiivka taking. I mean, you had 5 kilometers in just a couple of days, and that is in the middle of the town, but there is now all the village. There's now thought that that whole village is under Russian control, at least as far as Surat Maps, a pro-Russian mapper, is concerned. The other mappers still not quite there with them on that one. And when we look at what Surat Maps has claimed, the Russian army took control over 95% of Ocheretny. Combing operations continue in the northwestern part. In addition, troops entered the eastern part of the locality of Solovyove, and as you can see that there. And then we had actually no, there isn't a subsequent one from Surat Maps. So there is still a small amount of the village of or town of Ocheretny that the Russians do not control. That's in the grey zone. And of course, that's Surat Maps' interpretation. It might not be as bad as that. It could be that this is mainly grey zone. There are claims actually, and JR was telling me, he did the mapping, thanks to JR Legend, that there is a really big amount of grey zone change around here. So remember, this is all defensive lines for the Russians. The Russians robustly control these areas as according to each of these mappers. But it doesn't mean that as soon as you get past this red line, the Ukrainians are just sitting there lined up and the Ukrainians control this area. The Ukrainians are going to be further back here in trenches and whatnot, or in the fields around here. Apparently the grey zone is quite extensive, pushing out from Ocheretny there. So there are bigger changes than just the map these defensive lines will show. So that's what's going on there. Semenivka as well. No changes down near Pervomaisky. Still got this, quite significant difference between the mappers, and also this area of, no doubt, grey zone that almost looks operationally surrounded, but it depends which mappers you are believing there. Right, then when we come to Krasnohorivka, it looks pretty bad for the Ukrainians here. Surat Maps has the Russians extending their control fairly significantly into the southern parts of Krasnohorivka, and the other two mappers are not actually fairly different to what Surat Maps is saying, but still some gains for them, but much further to the southeast really. So very, very different mapping interpretations, but it does signify that the Russians are pushing forward. Here, Surat Map says that the Russians took full control over the southern district of Krasnohorivka. In addition, new positions were taken south of the refractory plant along the streets of Heolochna and Hoholya. Yes, something like that. Well done, me. That is... Let's go and put those roads on the map. I think it's going to be up in this area. Yep, so this street here is one of the streets being mentioned, and this is the other street being mentioned there. So the gains more into the centre or towards the centre of Krasnohorivka. And then Surat Maps adds to that by saying the Russian army entered the first buildings of the refractory plant, and we'll just plug that in the center of Krasnohorivka. The fighting continues there. Half the plant is now in the grey zone. So if we go back to the map, that's going to be this plant here, and the buildings they are in. This is the geolocation. So yep, that's the first building. That's why Surat Maps has that under Russian control now. Of course, you can argue that that they're in there doesn't necessarily mean that they control it. Depends how much they're getting hit there. Nonetheless, that's at least grey zone in that part of Krasnohorivka. So not looking great for the Ukrainians there. The Russians have had a real sort of renaissance in attacking there, where it was looking that like Novobakhmativka was a place. It sort of goes from one to the other. They get to a kind of bit of a dead end somewhere, and then find a crack somewhere else and drive a wedge into that and exploit it, and then run out of steam there, and then they go back to somewhere else. So at the moment, Mariinka and Novomykhailivka have been fairly stable, although there were some changes around Pobieda, and it's all about Krasnohorivka and that northern area of Avdiivka now. Yeah, and then as we come around the corner to Velika Novosilka, you can see that there's a tiny bit of a gain for the Russians, according to Surat maps, around Uruzhaini there, towards that little village, which means harvest, I do believe. And then we come on to Robotina, where we can see that the Russians, according to Surat maps, again have made some small gains to the south of that salient. We'll pop in to their Surat maps' tweet there that says, of this situation on the Zaporizhzhia front, the last 24 hours, the Russians made some new advances southeast of Robotina. So that's all they have to say. So just small advances there, possibly for the Russians. Then lastly, we're going to go to Krinky. So if you like the look of blue pins, then this might make you feel a bit happier. And this is it. I find this interesting because Surat Maps has this as robust Ukrainian control, which I find quite ballsy to say that, because this is all flattened, and although this looks to you and I on this now rather old satellite footage that you've got lots of stuff going on here, this is all just completely obliterated. There's rubble at most along here, and it's basically grass, potholes and rubble. And it's very difficult to see how you can have robust control over that area. And yet Surat Maps is saying, is almost to say that everything that was here was previously either Russian control or grey zone, and now they're changing it to Ukrainian control. So the situation in the Kherson front, since the beginning of the month, the axis, so it's not like this happened yesterday, the axis of Krinky has gained intensity again. Ukrainian army does not desist in its attempts to hold on to the south bank of the Dnipro. During the last 2 weeks, the troops widened the bridgehead by taking new positions on the bank of the Konka River. I think you've almost certainly got the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back in this southwestern area, and maybe even pushing them back in this northeastern area there. I would just call this grey zone personally. Nonetheless, they have that as Surat Maps has that as Ukrainian control, and actually all of that now as Ukrainian control. You can see the change. The change is that blue dotted polygon, and that's obviously meaning that it previously was not that. So yeah, good news for the Ukrainians. I don't know that it signifies that there's been suddenly a big gain there, as hinted at there. A couple of weeks. And really the last month they've been holding on there, and it hugely surprises me, because this is a bit kind of using the Ukrainian soldiers there as bait to suck in the Russian attract the Russian soldiers and equipment in there, so that it can be hammered by Magyar's drones and whatnot. I think it's a pretty thankless task to be sent across there to, hang out in some rubbleized basements, just so that the Russians can be lured into the area to then be hammered. However, from a zoomed out perspective, that is really useful, because the Russians have made huge losses in that area, and evidently continue to do so. It must still be advantageous for the Ukrainians to maintain that position, you would think, otherwise they wouldn't be there, right? Okay, that's the end of the Frontline update tonight. I did do a lot more waffling on about the kind of perspectives, but I think that is really important, because there's a lot of dooming and glooming about Ukrainian experiences on the front line at the moment, and they can't wait to get that ammunition from the US Presidential Drawdown Authority, and from the Czech Initiative, and from their own indigenous manufacturing and the usual stuff they're getting trickling through anyway. They can't wait to get that to the front line and allow themselves to stabilize and just build on that. Yeah, we'll see. Anyway, thanks so much for tuning in. Really appreciate you supporting the channel. Let me know what you think about the things I've said today. Toodle clips.